Hello again, Dan Alasso here with Chapter 2 of U.S. History 1. And in this chapter, we'll talk about all of the early European contacts with the Americas before we get to full-on colonization. So, let's begin. And let's begin at the tip of northern Newfoundland, where there's a provincial park called L'Anse-aux-Meadows, built on the site of a Viking settlement. Now, the Norse have a really old legend that the Viking hero Leif Erikson founded a colony in a new land that he called Vinland. The discovery of the Norse village in 1960 and its acceptance as a UNESCO World Heritage Site in 1978 established the Newfoundland colony as the oldest known European site in the Americas, and very probably as part of that Vinland settlement of the Norse legends. The Canadian ruins date from the appropriate period, about 1000, and artifacts found in the remains of 8 buildings include farm implements, blacksmith tools. There's also a spinning room containing a soapstone spindle and stone weights that were probably part of a loom. And the presence of these artifacts suggests and verifies the legends that the settlement probably included women and possibly even families. The sagas also record that in addition to fighting with the natives, the Norse traded with them. And it says that the natives were most interested in milk, which of course they had never seen before. And the presence of a spinning room and of cattle, which of course were not indigenous to the Americas, strongly suggests that the Newfoundland site was, at least intended to be, a permanent colony, rather than merely a seasonal fishing camp. It was almost certainly an extension of the permanent Viking settlements on Greenland that were the home of Leif Erikson's father, Eric the Red. The Norse legends say that in addition to trading with the natives, the Vinland colonists were regularly attacked by vicious warriors whom the Vikings called Skraelings, suggesting that the native Newfoundland population resisted the newcomers fairly effectively, at least some of the time. This map, drawn in 1570 and preserved in Scalehold, Iceland, shows Great Britain on the bottom right, Iceland in the center, and on the left, Grönlandia, or Greenland, Helleland, the land of flat stones, probably Baffin Island, Markland, the land of forests, probably Labrador, and Skraelingaland, which a note in the accompanying text says was close to Vinland, the land of meadows and grapevines. The forests of Markland would have been especially interesting to explorers from Greenland because the Norse settlements there lacked trees for building. And recently, since full genome analysis has become available, the DNA of the wood found in the remains of those Norse colonies in Greenland has been shown to be of North American origin. There were no forests in Greenland, and it had previously been believed that the Vikings had brought wood with them from Europe. The finding that the Greenlanders had been returning to the Americas regularly over a period of centuries will probably completely change the way we ultimately understand European exploration. And that's a change that we actually still have to look forward to. The scarcity of additional Norse sites, and of course the fact that Americans are not all speaking Norwegian, reminds us that the Vikings failed to sustain a permanent settlement in Vinland. While we can probably attribute this failure, partly at least, to the resistance of the Skraelings, another decisive factor was a change in global climate. In the middle of the 14th century, a 400-year period of global cooling, known as the Little Ice Age, began. Scientists have measured the effects of this climate change in tree rings as far away as Patagonia. Changes in temperature and weather were noticed and recorded in the Mayan and Aztec chronicles too, and also in Europe in paintings and illustrations like the one here depicting Londoners drinking, dancing, and skating on the frozen Thames River, which no longer freezes. Pack ice in the North Atlantic expanded southward, making travel from Greenland to America much more difficult and dangerous. Greenland's glaciers advanced, and shortened growing seasons threatened the 500-year-old settlements there. By the early 1400s, the Norse had abandoned these settlements. And without Greenland, of course, it was impossible to sustain a colony in Finland. This 1747 map of Old Greenland mentions that the coastline where settlements had once been located had become inaccessible due to floating and fixed mountains of ice. The map even includes the location of a legendary strait that was believed to have once allowed travelers to sail through the center of the island to North America, but had become, quote, shut up with ice. It's interesting to speculate what American history would look like today if the Vikings hadn't been defeated by the Skraelings and by climate change. It's possible that even during the Little Ice Age, Europeans continued to venture, when they could, into the icy Atlantic, and many probably sailed most of the way to the New World. At some point, Basque fishing fleets, for example, began crossing the North Atlantic to visit the Grand Banks, which they seem to already have been doing by the middle of the 15th century. The Banks are areas of shallow water on the edge of the North American continental shelf that are warmed by the Gulf Stream. And these warm, shallow waters are an ideal home for bottom-dwelling species like cod and nowadays lobster. Whoever first discovered the rich fisheries of the Grand Banks off Newfoundland and of George's Bank off Cape Cod, and the odds are very high that it was the Norse, by the late 1400s, thousands of Europeans were crossing the ocean to take advantage of this bounty. The Venetian navigator Giovanni Caboto, who anglicized his name to John Cabot because he was sailing for the English, reported in 1497 that Grand Banks cod were so abundant that you could almost walk across the water's surface on their backs. So cod had been fished in the North Atlantic at least since the beginning of Viking exploration, from 800 to 1000. The Vikings and the Basques used similar techniques, catching the fish close to shore and then drying them on wooden racks assembled on nearby beaches. They probably landed regularly on the coastlines near the fishing grounds to dry their fish and then replenish their supplies of fresh water before sailing home. While the locations of the prime fishing grounds were, for a long time, closely guarded trade secrets, by the late 1400s, the Portuguese had found out and had begun sailing their own fleets to the Grand Banks. Their innovation was to salt the cod before drying it, and salted cod is still an important element of Portuguese cuisine, although nowadays they get their fish from Iceland and Norway. The brother of Portugal's king, who was called Prince Henry the Navigator, spearheaded his country's exploration of Africa and the Atlantic in the 1400s. With his support, Portuguese mariners Bartolomeu Dias and Vasco da Gama successfully navigated an eastward route to Asia, around the bottom of Africa, establishing a foothold there that became a foundation of their nation's trade empire in the 15th and 16th centuries. Portuguese mariners also began to build an Atlantic empire by colonizing the Canary and the Cape Verde and the Azores Islands, as well as the island of Madeira. One of the principal products of these islands was sugar. Merchants then used these Atlantic outposts as debarkation points for subsequent journeys. And from these strategic points, Portugal spread its empire down the western and then around to the eastern coast of Africa, Angola and Mozambique, and then along the western coast of India, and eventually to Brazil on the eastern coast of South America. It also established trading posts in China and Japan. While the Portuguese didn't really rule over an immense landmass, their strategic holdings of islands and of coastal ports gave them almost unrivaled control of nautical trade routes and a global empire of trading posts during the 1400s. Both the Portuguese and the Spanish had been engaged in a centuries-long military campaign to regain territory in the Iberian Peninsula that had been conquered by the Muslim Umayyad Caliphate in the 8th century. The Reconquista, as it was called, ended in 1415 for the Portuguese, but it took Spain the rest of the 15th century to finally subdue the Emirate of Granada in what's now southern Spain. Portuguese exploration of the African coast, their discovery of a route to Asia around the southern Horn of Africa, and colonization of Atlantic islands in the 1400 inaugurated an era of aggressive European expansion. Columbus's mission to find a route to Asia across the Atlantic appealed to Ferdinand and Isabella, the monarchs of a newly unified Kingdom of Spain, partly because Portugal already controlled the route around Africa. The married monarchs finally defeated Granada in 1492. Once their Muslim rivals were conquered, the Spanish kingdom was able to direct its armies at other targets. In the 1500s, Spain surpassed Portugal as the dominant European power. This age of exploration and the subsequent creation of an imperial Atlantic world was one of the earliest phases of globalization, in which previously isolated groups, like the Africans and Native Americans and the Europeans, first came into contact with each other, sometimes with disastrous results. Although the Portuguese originally used their African colonies and fortresses, such as Elmina, primarily for trading gold, by the 16th century they had shifted their focus. The dungeon of Elmina Castle was converted into a holding pen for African slaves from the interior of the continent, while on the upper floors the Portuguese traders ate and slept and prayed in a chapel. Enslaved people languished in the dungeons for weeks or months until ships arrived to transport them to Europe or to the Americas. For many, the dungeon of Elmina was their last sight of their homelands. So the history of Spanish colonialism begins almost at that point of the unification of Spain itself. The marriage of Ferdinand of Aragon and Isabella of Castile in 1469 unified Catholic Spain and began the process of building a nation that could compete for worldwide power. Completing the Reconquista marked another step forward in this process of making Spain an imperial power. And Ferdinand and Isabella were now ready to look further afield. So the monarchs of the new Spanish kingdom sponsored extensive Atlantic exploration. Spain's most famous explorer, Christopher Columbus, was actually an Italian from Genoa. Using calculations based on other mariners' journeys, Columbus believed he could chart a westward route to India, which could be used to expand Spanish trade and to spread Christianity. Columbus had grown up reading tales like the Travels of Marco Polo, which had been printed for the first time just before his birth by Johannes Gutenberg on his new press. Columbus was also married to a Portuguese noblewoman named Filipa Moniz Perestrelo, who was the daughter of the governor of Porto Santo, an island near Madeira. As a navigator in Portuguese-controlled waters off the coast of Africa, Columbus probably also had many opportunities to hear stories of fishermen who had gone to the Grand Banks in search of cod. Beginning in 1485, Columbus approached first the Genoese, and then the Venetian, then the Portuguese and English, and finally Spanish authorities, asking for ships and funding to explore his westward route. All of those that he petitioned, including Ferdinand and Isabella at first, rebuffed him. Their nautical experts all concurred that Columbus's estimates of the width of the Atlantic Ocean were far too low, based on their pretty correct understanding of the circumference of the Earth. What they didn't know, of course, was that there were entire continents and another ocean, the Pacific, between a westward traveler and Asia. And Columbus seems to have been aware that fishermen had gone somewhere, caught cod, and returned safely. A lot of historians, including myself, are beginning to believe that that knowledge, or at least that rumor, probably influenced his thinking. After years of petitioning, Ferdinand and Isabella agreed to finance Columbus's expedition in 1492, and they supplied him with 3 ships. The Spanish monarchs knew that Portuguese mariners had already reached the southern tip of Africa and had found a route to the Indian Ocean. They understood that if they were not challenged, the Portuguese would dominate trade with Asia. Although he was basically correct about the distance that he would need to travel across the Atlantic to reach land, Columbus was unaware, of course, of the existence of the American continents or the Pacific Ocean. On October 12th, 1492, he made landfall on an island in the Bahamas after a little over 2 months at sea. And then he sailed to an island that he named Hispaniola, which is where the present-day Dominican Republic and Haiti are. Believing that he had landed in the East Indies, Columbus called the native Taínos that he found there Indios, giving rise to the term Indian for any native people of the New World. Columbus explored the islands until his flagship, the Santa Maria, ran aground in a storm on Hispaniola and had to be abandoned. The 2 remaining ships didn't have enough room for all of his men, so with the permission of a local chief, Columbus left 39 of his sailors in a settlement that he called La Navidad, because the ship had run aground on Christmas. On Columbus's return to Spain in March 1493, the Spanish monarchs celebrated him and granted him the title of Admiral of the Ocean Sea, and named him Viceroy and Governor of the lands that he had discovered. As a devoted Catholic, Columbus had agreed, prior to first sailing west, that part of the wealth that they all expected to gain from his voyage would be used to continue the fight against Islam. Columbus made 3 more voyages over the next decade, establishing Spain's first settlement in the New World on the island of Hispaniola. Many other Europeans followed in Columbus's footsteps, also inspired by dreams of wealth. Columbus made some extravagant claims about the territory he had explored, including that the rivers were filled with gold. His 1493 report about his expedition to his royal patrons, which was called the Probanza de Merito, or the Proof of Merit, described his discovery of many islands that he believed were right off the coast of Asia, and did a lot to inspire excitement in Europe. Another Italian navigator, Amerigo Vespucci, visited and mapped the coasts of both North and South America, and recognized that the land was vast and new. Vespucci actually coined the term New World in a work that bore that title in Latin, Mundus Novus, and it described his voyages in a Portuguese ship, which among other locations landed in the harbor that became Rio de Janeiro in Brazil. Mundus Novus was rapidly translated into several European languages and became so popular that when German cartographer Martin Waldseemüller published a new map of the world in 1507, he named the 2 continents that he added America, after Vespucci. Waldseemüller's map includes only the coastal regions of the Americas, of course, that had been mapped by 1507. Europeans still didn't understand the size of the continents or the extent of the Pacific Ocean until later. The Pacific was first discovered for Europeans by Vasco Núñez de Balboa in 1513, when he crossed the Isthmus of Panama and saw it for the first time. Ferdinand Magellan's mission, that then rounded Cape Horn at the southern tip of the Americas and crossed the Pacific, happened in 1519. This is the first known circumnavigation of the entire world, although Magellan didn't live to see its conclusion. And this 1492 Columbus landfall in the Caribbean accelerated the rivalry between Spain and Portugal. These 2 rivals for domination of European politics built a lot of their wealth and prestige through the acquisition of new lands. Earlier in the 1400s, Pope Sixtus IV had granted Portugal the right to all of the land south of the Cape Verde Islands. And this led the Portuguese king to claim that the lands that had been discovered by Columbus actually belonged to Portugal. Seeking to ensure that Columbus's findings would remain Spanish, Spain's monarchs appealed to the new pope, Spanish-born Rodrigo Borgia, who went by the title Pope Alexander VI. And he issued 2 papal decrees in 1493 that gave legitimacy to Spain's Atlantic claims at the expense of Portugal. So, hoping to salvage Portugal's Atlantic holdings in light of this new hostile papal ruling, King João II began negotiating with Spain. The resulting Treaty of Tordesillas in 1494 drew a north-south line at about 47 degrees 37 minutes west longitude. Spain agreed to take the mostly unknown territory to the west of the line, while Portugal retained the lands east of the line, including their pre-existing African colonies, their route to Asia, and the east coast of Brazil, since the treaty line cut through South America. As I said, Columbus returned to the Caribbean 4 times. His first return was in 1495 with 17 ships, 1,200 men, and according to his diaries, quote, seeds and cuttings for the planting of wheat, chickpeas, melons, onions, radishes, salad greens, grapevines, sugarcane, and fruit stones for the founding of orchards. Other Old World crops that thrived in the Americas included coffee and bananas, which were brought from the Canary Islands in 1516. Following the example of Portugal, the Spanish had introduced sugar plantations to the Canary Islands in the early 15th century. So it only made sense for both the Portuguese and the Spanish to try this profitable plant in the new tropical paradise that their explorers had discovered across the Atlantic. Cattle were delivered to Spanish conquistadors in Mexico in 1521, and by 1614, according to one of the conquistador chronicles, the residents of Santiago, which is in Chile, over 4,000 miles away, possessed 39,250 head, as well as flocks totaling 623,825 sheep. According to local legends, which may of course be exaggerated, when Francisco Pizarro first invaded Peru in 1524, he crossed the Andes with only 80 fighting men and only 40 horses, but with over 2,000 pigs. Because, of course, these would be a mobile food supply for his soldiers. Most of the really significant Eurasian species brought to the Americas had already been introduced by the Spanish by the early 1500s, long before North American settlement began. Even species like the wild horses of the American West that would later transform Plains Indian culture were actually escapees from the herds of the conquistadors. The Americas were home to very few large mammal species that could be domesticated. Domestication is only successful with social animals that will accept a human as the leader of their pack or their herd. Nearly all the species that humans have successfully domesticated, the familiar residents of the traditional farmyard, had originated in Europe and Asia. And these include goats, sheep, cows, horses, pigs, and chickens. Eurasians began domesticating these animals between 10 and 15,000 years ago. And this was just a little bit too late for the people of Beringia to bring domesticated animals with them into North America. And, of course, in any case, the Beringians were tundra hunters, not temperate zone pastoralists. But, of course, as any good hunter would, the Beringians had brought their dogs. So there were dogs in America. Historians call the transfer of plants and animals that began with this 15th and early 16th century European contact the Columbian Exchange. The directions of these transfers and their effects on the environments and the people of both Europe and the Americas shaped the modern world that we live in. American maize and potatoes and cassava, developed by Native Americans, fed growing European and Asian populations, allowing the building of new cities and new industries. And of course, they remain 3 of the 5 largest staple crops in the world, even today. European animals such as pigs and sheep and chicken and cattle thrived in the Americas, which allowed both natives and Europeans to expand and to change their cultures. But before that happened, the most significant change of all was the largely accidental transfer of viruses and bacteria from Europeans to Americans, which caused the deaths of possibly 90% of the native population of the Americas. Most of humanity's major diseases originated in animals and then crossed from domesticated species to their human keepers. These are called zoonotic diseases. Whooping cough and influenza came from pigs. Measles and smallpox came from cattle. Malaria and avian flu came from chickens. Thousands of years ago, though. So the people who domesticated these species and lived with the animals for hundreds of generations co-evolved with them. Animal diseases became survivable when people developed antibodies and immunities. Without this inherited protection, even a routine childhood disease, such as chickenpox, would be devastating. The introduction of disease into an area without immunity is called a virgin soil epidemic. These types of epidemics had happened in Eurasia, such as when the Romans had spread smallpox into the populations that they conquered, and also in Europe, when the expanding Mongols had introduced the bubonic plague. The Black Death killed probably half of the population of Europe in the 14th century, and it reduced world population by over 100 million. But it was even worse in the Americas. Virgin soil epidemics began in the Americas when explorers and colonists and missionaries introduced Eurasian diseases to Native Americans who had been isolated for thousands of years. The Americans had no immunities at all, and even diseases which were no longer particularly deadly to Europeans killed millions. The Eurasian diseases that attacked these native populations included smallpox, measles, chickenpox, influenza, typhus, cholera, diphtheria, typhoid, bubonic plague, scarlet fever, whooping cough, and malaria. Columbus's discovery opened a floodgate of Spanish exploration and conquest. Inspired by tales of rivers of gold and of timid natives who could be easily exploited, Spanish explorers were relentless in their quest for land and gold. The conquistadors had been well trained during the centuries of the recently concluded Reconquista, in which men of common birth learned to use conquest as a path to wealth and nobility. For example, Hernán Cortés hoped to gain hereditary privilege for his family, tribute payments and labor from natives, and an annual pension for his service to the crown. Cortés arrived on Hispaniola in 1504 and took part in the conquest of that island. And then, hoping to win his own honor and a territory to rule over, Cortés later explored the Yucatan Peninsula. In 1519, he entered Tenochtitlan, the capital of the Aztec Empire. He and his men were astonished by the sophisticated causeways and aqueducts and gardens and markets and temples of the city. But they were also alarmed by the practice of human sacrifice that was central to Aztec religion. Above all else, Aztec gold fascinated the Spanish adventurers. Hoping to gain control over the Aztec capital, Cortés took the ruler Moctezuma hostage. The Spanish then murdered hundreds of high-ranking Mexica, which is the name the Aztecs called themselves, during a festival to celebrate Huitzilopochtli, the solar god of war. The ambush of these unarmed dancers angered the people of Tenochtitlan, who rose up against the invaders in their city. Cortés and his people fled for their lives in an event that they ironically called the Noche Triste, the sad night, when they retreated down one of Tenochtitlan's causeways to safety on shore. Cortés then slowly created alliances with native peoples in neighboring city-states who resented Aztec rule. It took nearly a year for the Spanish and thousands of native allies who joined with them to defeat the Aztecs in Tenochtitlan. They besieged the city after the capital was thrown into chaos by epidemic diseases. In August 1521, after fending off rival Spanish explorers, Cortés claimed Tenochtitlan for Spain and renamed it Mexico City. So disease was a big factor even in Cortés's capture of Tenochtitlan. The impact of these Eurasian illnesses on Native Americans was one of human history's most severe population disasters. Even the Black Death didn't kill as large a percentage of Europeans. For example, there were probably 1 million people living on the Caribbean island of Hispaniola in late 1492 when Columbus left his 39 contagious sailors at La Navidad. By 1548, there were only 500 natives left. The populations of other Caribbean islands were similarly wiped out. Big islands like Cuba and Puerto Rico. Whole civilizations disappeared. And this was not only a tragedy for the cultures that vanished, it also began a cycle of violence that became central to American history. Because once there were no longer any natives left to work on European sugar plantations, African slaves became crucial to the success of the West Indies economy. The greater population densities of Central and South America helped contagious diseases spread even more quickly there. Heavily traveled roads in central Mexico and trade routes beyond actually spread disease past the areas that had been reached by Spanish explorers. Cities were wiped out that had never even seen a white man. The population of the Aztec heartland dropped from possibly 25 million on the eve of the Spanish conquest in 1519 to just under 17 million a decade later. That means 1 out of every 3 people died in just 10 years. After another decade, the Aztec population was reduced to about 6 million. That means 3 out of 4 people in the Aztec world disappeared in 20 years. Imagine writing a list of all the people you know, your friends and your family, and then randomly crossing out 3 out of every 4 names. By 1580, the Aztec Empire had been hollowed out to less than 2 million people, from a starting point, again, of 25 million. Now, if your list had begun with 10 people, you're down to 1. Isolated rural communities may have been a little luckier, for a while, than central cities on trade routes, which were often completely emptied. The city of Zempoala, for example, held between 25,000 and 30,000 Aztec citizens in 1519. There were only 25 native inhabitants left in 1550. The Inca Empire in the Andes suffered the same fate. From a starting population well over 11 million, 90% of the South Americans died. And they started dying before the European conquistadors arrived, which caused confusion and dismay. When Francisco Pizarro crossed the Andes with his 80 fighting men and possibly 2,000 pigs, he found social chaos. Huayna Capac, the Inca emperor, who had just triumphantly extended the empire into Chile in the south and Ecuador in the north, had died of smallpox at Quito, along with his oldest son and heir. His 2 younger sons then fought a brutal civil war for control of the empire, at the same time that epidemic was decimating the population. The younger son, Atahualpa, finally defeated and assassinated his older brother Huáscar, with Pizarro's help. And then the war and the weakness of the reduced Inca population gave Pizarro the opportunity he needed to capture and kill Atahualpa in 1533, effectively ending the Inca Empire. Pizarro did this with 80 Spanish fighting men against a population that had begun over 11 million. And then he built his capital at the Inca imperial city of Cusco and also founded Lima on the coast. Like Cortez, Pizarro had to combat not only the natives of the new territory that he was conquering, but also competitors from his own country. A Spanish rival actually assassinated him in 1541. Hernando de Soto, who had participated in Pizarro's conquest of the Inca, landed an expedition in Florida in 1539 and explored territory now in the states of Georgia, South Carolina, North Carolina, Tennessee, Alabama, Mississippi, and Oklahoma. Everywhere he went, the conquistador reported that the land was thickly settled with large towns. De Soto didn't stay long. He died of fever in Louisiana in 1542. And then most of the region wasn't visited again by Europeans until the French aristocrat La Salle traveled down the Mississippi River around 1670. Where De Soto had seen fortified towns, La Salle saw no one. The entire region had been emptied by disease, and the French explorer recorded traveling hundreds of miles without passing a single village. Historians were actually unaware until recently that the American South had once been heavily populated with natives before the arrival of contagious Spanish explorers and missionaries. Traditional Eurocentric American histories of exploration often present the victory of the Spanish over the Aztecs and the Incas as an example of the superiority of Europeans over savage and primitive Indians. The reality, of course, is far more complex. When Cortés arrived in central Mexico, he encountered a region that was already simmering with native conflict. Far from being unified and happy under Aztec rule, many in the Valley of Mexico resented it and were ready to rebel. Cortés was also aided by a Nahua slave woman called Malintzin, whom the natives of Tabasco had given him as a tribute slave. Malintzin spoke Spanish as well as several native languages, and she translated for Cortés in his dealings with Moctezuma. Malintzin also, willingly or under pressure, had a physical relationship with Cortés. Their son, Martín Cortés, was one of the first mestizos, or people of mixed indigenous and European descent, in the colony. Malintzin remains a controversial figure in the history of the Atlantic world, especially in Latin America. Some consider her a traitor because she helped Cortés to conquer the Aztecs, while others see her as a victim of European imperialism, and also of her own culture. After all, she was already a slave when the Tabasco gave her to Cortés. In either case, she demonstrates one of many ways in which native people responded to the arrival of the Spanish. Without her, Cortés might not have been able to communicate, and without the language bridge, he surely would have been less successful in destabilizing the Aztec Empire. By this, as well as other means, native people helped to shape the conquest of the Americas. Spain's drive to enlarge its empire led other hopeful conquistadors to push further into the Americas, eager to replicate the successes of Cortés and Pizarro. Francisco Vázquez de Coronado was born into a noble family in Spain and went to Mexico, then called New Spain, in 1535. He presided as governor over the province of Nueva Galicia, where he heard rumors of wealth to the north in a golden city called Quivira. Between 1540 and 1542, Coronado led a large expedition of Spaniards and native allies into the lands north of Mexico City. And for the next several years, they explored the area that's now the southwestern United States. During the winter of 1540 to 1541, the explorers waged war against the Tiwa in present-day New Mexico. Rather than leading to the discovery of new hoards of gold and silver, however, the expedition simply left Coronado bankrupt. European promoters of colonization claimed that the Americas were overflowing with treasures. The realities of life in the Americas, violence, exploitation, and particularly the need for workers, were soon driving the practice of slavery and forced labor. Growth of the European colonies was limited by the number of workers available. Europeans were not interested in mere subsistence. They wanted to become rich. Even where there were valuable natural resources waiting to be exploited, like the Silver Mountain at Potosi, acquiring wealth required more physical labor than Europeans alone were able or willing to do themselves. To add to the labor force, Spain granted encomiendas, which were legal rights to native labor, to these conquistadors who had proved their service to the crown. Encomiendas had been used in Spain during the Reconquista, when Spaniards had been given lands taken from the Muslims and had then become responsible for the spiritual development of the people on those lands who had been forced to convert to Christianity. In Spanish America, the conquistadors who were granted encomiendas were also theoretically responsible for Christianizing the Indians. But in practice, their focus was much more on extracting labor. Some native peoples who had sided with the conquistadors, like the Tlaxcalan, were also occasionally granted encomiendas. And Malintzin, the Nahua woman who had helped Cortés defeat the Aztecs and who bore his children, was also granted one. The Spanish believed that native peoples should work for them by right of conquest, and in return, the Spanish would bring them Christian salvation. In theory, the relationship did consist of reciprocal obligations that would be of some value to the natives. who, of course, would have their eternal souls saved. But in practice, the Spaniards ruthlessly exploited the encomienda, seeing native people as little more than beasts of burden. And native people everywhere resisted both the labor obligations and the Spaniards' efforts to change their ancestral ancient belief systems. Many retained their religions or incorporated only the parts of Catholicism that made sense to them. And in addition to the encomiendas, the Spanish adapted an Inca Empire labor system called the mita, which had required citizens of the empire to work for the public benefit. Men in Inca society between the ages of 15 and 50 had worked on public projects, such as the building and repair of the royal road through the Andes, or fishing, or farming. Under the Inca, mita work was seasonal and did not prevent men from providing for their own families. Under Spanish rule, the duration of the mita expanded and work conditions worsened until the mita became synonymous with slavery. The Potosi mita, for example, drew workers from across southern Peru and what's now Bolivia, and potential draftees often injured or maimed themselves to avoid recruitment. Mitas and encomiendas were enforced by a great deal of violence. One Spaniard, Bartolomé de las Casas, actually denounced the brutality of Spanish rule. A Dominican friar, Las Casas had been one of the earliest settlers in the Spanish West Indies. In his early life in the Americas, Las Casas had owned Indian slaves as a recipient of the encomienda. But after witnessing what he believed to be the savagery of the Spanish, in 1515, Las Casas released his natives, gave up his encomienda, and began to advocate for humane treatment of native peoples. He lobbied for changes that would eventually be known as the New Laws, which in time would eliminate the encomienda system. Ironically, Las Casas advocated importing African slaves to reduce the exploitation of the native people. And Las Casas' exposure of the Spaniards' horrific treatment of the Indians was amplified by Spain's new Protestant adversaries and inspired what became known as the Black Legend, a depiction of the Spanish as egregiously bloodthirsty conquerors with no regard for human life. English writers and others seized on the idea of Spain's ruthlessness to support their own colonial projects. By demonizing the Spanish, they justified their own efforts, which they depicted as more humane. All European colonizers, however, shared a disregard for Indians. And as native populations disappeared as a result of the Columbian Exchange, Europeans had to look elsewhere for forced labor. By the middle of the 16th century, Africans had become an important component of the forced labor landscape, producing sugar and tobacco for European markets. Europeans viewed Africans as non-Christians, which they considered a justification for enslavement. Denied any real control over their lives, the slaves endured horrendous conditions. They resisted enslavement, of course, and their resistance was met with violence. Portuguese factories on the west coast of Africa, like Elmina Castle in what's now Ghana, served as holding pens for slaves captured by Europeans or other Africans and brought from the interior. The Spanish, prevented by the Treaty of Tordesillas from establishing their own slave-taking colonies on the West African coast, established a monopoly contract called the Asiento in 1518. After the Genoese and the Portuguese had supplied slaves to the Spanish for well over a century, the Dutch West India Company was awarded the monopoly in 1675 and held it until 1713, when the Asiento was passed to the British South Sea Company, which held it until 1750. The profits of European colonialism had a profound impact both in the Americas and back in Europe. An exchange of ideas, fueled and financed in part by these New World commodities and wealth, began to connect European nations and also to touch the parts of the world that the Europeans conquered. In Spain, wealth from the Americas helped to fuel a golden age, a siglo de oro, when Spanish art and literature flourished. Riches poured in from the colonies, especially from the silver mines at Potosi in the Andes and Zacatecas in Mexico. New ideas poured in from other countries and from new lands. The Habsburg dynasty, which ruled a collection of territories, including Austria, the Netherlands, Naples, Sicily, and Spain, patronized and financed the work of painters and sculptors and musicians and architects and writers. One of this period's most famous works is the novel The Ingenious Gentleman Don Quixote of La Mancha by Miguel de Cervantes. This two-volume book, published in 1605 and 1618, told a colorful tale of an hidalgo, a gentleman of humble birth, who had read so many tales of chivalry and knighthood that he became unable to tell reality from fiction. With his faithful sidekick Sancho Panza, Don Quixote left reality behind and set out to revive chivalry by doing battle with windmills that he perceived as enemies of Spain. In addition to being absurd, the windmills were a clever reference to the United Provinces of the Netherlands, which had been involved in a decades-long war for their independence from the Spanish Empire. Until the 1550s, the Roman Catholic Church had provided religious structure for Christian Europe. The Vatican exercised great power over the lives of Europeans, controlling their religious observance, learning, and scholarship, and also levying taxes on the faithful. Spain, with its New World wealth, was a strong supporter of Rome and was committed to spreading the faith. The Habsburgs became Holy Roman emperors, in addition to rulers of the Spanish Empire. However, beginning with the reform efforts of Martin Luther in 1517 and John Calvin in the 1530s, Catholic dominance in Europe came under attack as the Reformation began. During the 16th century, Protestantism spread through Northern Europe, and Catholic leaders responded by attempting to extinguish what was seen as a heretical menace. Religious turmoil between Catholics and Protestants spread into their colonies as well, of course, since nations competed not only for control of new territories and their wealth, but also for the dominance of their own religious beliefs there. Martin Luther was a German theologian at the University of Wittenberg who took issue with the church's practice of selling indulgences, which absolved sinners in return for cash donations to finance the building of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome. He also objected to the delivery of the Mass in Latin, arguing that it really failed to instruct German Catholics who didn't understand the language. Luther published a Bible and a hymnal in German, and he also attacked the church's policy of imposing tithes, which were a required payment to the church that also enriched the clergy. Although he had intended to reform the church while remaining a part of it, Luther's actions instead resulted in his excommunication, triggering the development of a protest movement, or a Protestant movement, that became a new branch of Christianity. The Catholic Church condemned him as a heretic, but Lutheranism spread through northern Germany and Scandinavia. Like Luther, the French lawyer John Calvin advocated making the Bible accessible to ordinary people in their own languages. In 1535, Calvin fled Catholic France and led his part of the Reformation movement from Geneva, Switzerland. Calvinism emphasized human powerlessness and stressed the belief that God had already selected a few chosen people for salvation, while everyone else was predestined to damnation. Calvin's ideas spread to the Netherlands and to Scotland. And the idea that Scripture should be available in the everyday language of worshippers inspired the English scholar William Tyndale to translate the Bible into English in 1526. A more complete break from the Catholic Church in England occurred in the 1530s, when Henry VIII established the Church of England as the state religion. Previously a devout Catholic, Henry had initially opposed the Reformation. Pope Leo X had even awarded him the title Defender of the Faith. Henry's allegiance to Rome ended when his Spanish Catholic wife, Catherine of Aragon, the daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella, failed to produce a male heir for Henry. The king sought an annulment to their marriage, but the Pope, who was a close ally of the Habsburgs, refused this request. In response, Henry created the Church of England, with himself as its head. This version of Protestantism retained a lot of the elements of Catholicism, such as bishops, and it's now known as the Episcopal Church in America. But it did leave him free to annul his own marriage and to marry Anne Boleyn. Henry's new queen also failed to bear him a son, and when she was accused of, or possibly framed for adultery, Henry VIII had her executed. His third wife, Jane Seymour, at long last delivered a son, Edward, who ruled for only a short time after his father, before dying in 1553 at the age of 15. Mary, the daughter of Henry VIII, and his discarded Spanish first wife, Catherine of Aragon, then came to the throne, committed to restoring Catholicism. She earned the nickname Bloody Mary for the many executions of Protestants that she ordered during her reign. Mary married her cousin, Philip II, the King of Spain, who actually became King of England as well, until Mary's death in 1558. When Queen Elizabeth I, Anne Boleyn's daughter, took the throne, Philip proposed marriage also with her, so that he could continue as King of England. Elizabeth turned him down. And over the first 2 decades of her reign, she gave many English sea captains letters of marque that authorized them to engage in piracy against Spanish ships. In the end, increasing hostility between the nations led Philip to plan an invasion of Britain, supposedly to return the nation to Catholicism. The invasion was launched in the summer of 1588, but the British Navy and storms at sea defeated the Spanish Armada and established Britain and its ally, the Dutch Republic, as Europe's leading naval powers. Under Elizabeth, the Church of England again became the state church, retaining the hierarchical structure and many of the rituals of the Catholic Church. However, by the late 1500s, some began to agitate for even more reform. Known as Puritans, they wanted to erase all vestiges of Catholicism from the Church of England. Many critics called the Puritans pious frauds, and some powerful people saw them as a security threat because of their opposition to the national church, of which the monarch was the head. Some Puritans fled England and ultimately crossed the Atlantic in the 1620s and 1630s to create New England, where they could not only practice their religion freely, but also attain wealth and social standing and even power that was unavailable to them in England. After the defeat of its armada, Spain retained its American empire, but the Spanish could no longer prevent England and other European rivals, like the French and the Dutch, from colonizing smaller islands in the Caribbean and ultimately the mainland of North America. Although in the 1500s, England had lacked the naval power and financial resources, really, to challenge the Spanish and the Portuguese in the Atlantic, English monarchs had carefully monitored developments in this new Atlantic world and had begun to assert England's claim to part of the Americas. As early as 1497, Henry VII of England had commissioned Giovanni Caboto, who I mentioned earlier, John Cabot, an Italian mariner, to explore the lands across the ocean. Caboto had sailed from England to the Grand Banks and had planted the English flag on Newfoundland. And for the next century, British fishermen regularly crossed the Atlantic to fish cod off the North American coast. However, for the time, English colonization efforts in the 1500s were closer to home, as England devoted its energy to subjugating Ireland. England could not commit to large-scale colonization in the Americas as long as Spain appeared ready to invade Catholic Ireland or Scotland, or to aid in insurrections there. Still, Queen Elizabeth I commissioned English privateers who were authorized to raid the enemy at will. These professional pirates cruised the Caribbean, plundering Spanish ships whenever they could. Each year, the Spanish took more than 100,000 pounds from Spain in this way. One of the most famous English privateers, Francis Drake, first made a name for himself in 1573, when he took a ship loaded with silver, gold, and pearls worth 40,000 pounds. And Elizabeth did authorize an early attempt at colonization in 1584, when Sir Walter Raleigh, a favorite of the Queen's, attempted to establish a colony at Roanoke Island, off the coast of present-day North Carolina. The colony was small, consisting of only 117 people, and their governor, John White, returned to England in late 1587 for more people and supplies, but was unable to return to Roanoke for 3 years, because of course the Spanish Armada was on its way. When White's resupply ships finally did arrive in 1590, the entire colony had vanished. The only trace the colonies had left behind was the word Croatoan, carved into a fence surrounding the village. Governor White never discovered whether the colonists had gone to live with the Indians on a nearby island, now called Hatteras, or whether some disaster had befallen them all. Roanoke is still known as the Lost Colony. In 1588, a promoter of English colonization named Thomas Harriot described the new lands to the English and encouraged exploration and colonization. Boosters of colonization promoted both commercial advantages and the establishment of Protestantism in the Americas. English merchants and aristocrats pooled their resources to form joint stock companies that received charters from the crown to establish colonies. The first permanent English settlement was established by a joint stock company called the Virginia Company. Named for Elizabeth, the Virgin Queen, the company gained royal approval to establish colonies on the east coast of North America. And in 1606, it sent 2 expeditions to the New World. The northern colony, established on the Kennebec River, quickly failed. But in early 1607, 144 settlers arrived in Chesapeake Bay, and on a river that they called the James, in honor of their new king, James I, they established a settlement in a marshy region that had been shunned by local Indians and named it Jamestown. Despite deadly struggles, the colony survived. Many of Jamestown's first settlers came from elite families, younger sons who would not inherit their father's estates and titles, but who also had not learned any skills that they would need to survive in the new colony. The Jamestown adventurers believed that they would find instant wealth in the New World, just as they imagined the Spanish conquistadors had done. And they did not actually expect to have to work very hard for it. George Percy, the 8th son of the Earl of Northumberland, was among them. His account of the starving times, excerpted in the primary source section, illustrates the hardships that the English confronted in Virginia in 1607. The 144 men and boys who started the Jamestown colony were completely unprepared for the hardships that they would face, not to mention native resistance. By the end of the first winter, only 38 had survived. Percy, who served briefly as governor of Jamestown, kept records of the first months of the colony, which were then published in London in 1608. In the early 16th century, France also joined the race to explore the New World and exploit its resources. Navigator Jacques Cartier claimed northern North America and named the area New France. From 1534 to 1541, he made 3 voyages to the Gulf of St. Lawrence and the St. Lawrence River. Like other explorers, Cartier made exaggerated claims of the wealth available in America. But he was unable to send great riches back to France or to establish a permanent settlement in North America. French explorer Samuel de Champlain then visited the Caribbean in 1601 and then the coast of New England in 1603, before traveling even further north and founding Quebec in 1608. Champlain made numerous Atlantic crossings as he worked kind of tirelessly to promote New France. Unlike other Europeans, the French fostered good relations with native peoples, paving the way for French exploration further into the continent than other Europeans got, around the Great Lakes, around Hudson Bay, and eventually all the way to the Mississippi River. Champlain made an alliance with the Huron Confederacy and the Algonquin and agreed to arm them and to fight with them against their enemy, the Iroquois. The French were primarily interested in establishing commercial outposts, so they created extensive trading networks that relied on native hunters and trappers to supply furs, especially beaver pelts, in exchange for French trade goods. Beaver undercoat fur was very fine and could be felted into very high quality hats that were extremely popular and profitable throughout Europe. When Spanish control in the Caribbean began to weaken, the French also turned their attention to smaller islands in the West Indies. And by 1635, they had colonized Guadeloupe and Martinique. Later in the 17th century, the French would challenge Spain on larger islands, including Hispaniola itself. Though it lagged far behind Spain, France's Caribbean possessions became lucrative sugar islands and produced huge profits for French planters by, of course, relying on African slave labor. Dutch entrance into the Atlantic world is also part of this story of religious and imperial conflict in early modern Europe. During the 16th century, the provinces of the Spanish Netherlands had adopted Calvinism and had begun a long struggle to achieve their independence from Catholic Spain. Established in 1581, but not recognized as independent by Spain until 1648, the Dutch Republic, led by Holland, relied on powerful corporations. The Dutch East India Company, chartered in 1602 to trade in Asia, and the Dutch West India Company, established in 1621 to colonize and trade in the Americas. While employed by the Dutch East India Company in 1609, the English sea captain Henry Hudson explored New York Harbor and the river that now carries his name. Like many explorers of the time, Hudson was actually seeking a northwest passage through America to Asia and its wealth. Europeans remained unaware of the width of North America until really the 19th century. And of course, they never found a water route through the continent. But the ample furs that Hudson found, especially, once again, beaver pelts, provided a reason to claim it for the Netherlands. The Dutch named their colony New Netherlands, and it served as a fur trading post for the expanding Dutch West India Company when it was established. With headquarters at New Amsterdam on the island of Manhattan, the Dutch set up several regional trading posts, including one at present-day Albany. A brisk trade in furs with local Algonquian and Iroquois people, the enemies of the Hurons and the French, brought the Dutch and local native peoples together in a commercial and military alliance that extended throughout the Hudson River and beyond. England came kind of late into the colonization race. As Jamestown limped along in the 1610s, the Spanish Empire expanded around the world and grew rich from its global colonial project. In addition to dominating the Caribbean, Central, and South America, the Spanish also conquered the Philippines in 1565, which would be named after King Philip II. And Spain didn't completely ignore North America either. Also in 1565, they established the first permanent European settlement in North America at St. Augustine in Florida. Florida would remain a Spanish territory most of the time until the early 19th century, and several wars would be fought between Spanish Florida and the British colonies to its north, which may help to explain why St. Augustine is not better remembered as the first European settlement in North America. After Jamestown's founding, English colonization of the New World accelerated. In 1609, a ship that had been bound for Jamestown foundered in a storm and landed on Bermuda. Some believe this incident helped to inspire Shakespeare's 1611 play, The Tempest. The ship's commander, George Somers, claimed the island for the English crown. The English also began to colonize small islands in the Caribbean that had been overlooked by the Spanish, establishing themselves on St. Kitts in 1624, Barbados in 1627, Nevis in 1628, Montserrat 1632, and Antigua, also 1632. From the start, the English West Indies focused on commerce and produced the cash crops, tobacco, and sugar. Very quickly, by the mid-1600s, Barbados became one of the most important of English colonies, based on profits from the sugar produced there. Barbados specialized in sugar to such an extent that the colony depended on slaves for labor and on New England and the mid-Atlantic colonies for food and for animal feed. Barbados, which emulated the Spanish and Portuguese plantation models, became a model for other English slave societies in the Caribbean and later on the American mainland, a model that differed radically from England itself, where slavery was not practiced. English Puritans also began to colonize the Americas in the 1620s and 1630s. These intensely religious migrants dreamed of creating communities of Reformed Protestantism, where they would not only be able to worship freely, but have opportunities for social advancement that were denied them in England. One of the first groups of Puritans to move to North America, known as the Pilgrims and led by William Bradford, had originally left England to live in the Netherlands in 1610. But after 10 years, fearing their children were losing their Englishness, their English identity, by living among the Dutch, in 1620 they settled at Plymouth, the first successful English settlement in New England. The Pilgrims differed from other Puritans in their insistence on completely separating from what they saw as a very corrupt Church of England, so they were known as separatists. Like Jamestown, Plymouth occupies an iconic place in American national memory. The tale of the 102 migrants who crossed the Atlantic aboard the Mayflower and of their struggle to survive is a well-known Thanksgiving story that includes the signing of the Mayflower Compact, a 1620 document that some see as an early expression of democratic spirit because of the cooperative nature of the agreement to live and work together. In 1630, a much larger contingent of Puritans left England itself to escape conformity to the Church of England and founded the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Although the Bay Colony's leader, John Winthrop, wrote eloquently of their goal to create a city upon a hill at Boston that would be an example of the pious life, leaders of the colony were also very interested in material success. Winthrop, the Puritan leader who helped establish Boston and who was governor of the colony 4 times before 1650, had already sent his second son Henry to help establish Barbados in 1626. When Oliver Cromwell's Civil War halted the flow of commercial shipping between England and the only 10-year-old Bay Colony in 1640, trade with the West Indies saved Boston's economy. And Governor Winthrop's younger son, Samuel, joined the growing community of New England merchants in the Caribbean Sugar Islands in 1647. We'll have a lot more to say about New England commerce and, of course, about slavery as we go forward. But that's all for now. So I hope you found this a bit interesting. Thanks very much for watching. I will see you again very soon.